This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Now, during this part of the season, we're going to talk a lot about Andrew Berry, the good and the bad. So what I wanted to do was go through Andrew Berry's tenure and talk about 3 of his biggest failures and some of his biggest successes. We're going to start with one of the big failures. And this is Andrew Billings. But understand, Andrew Billings is the figurehead of a much larger problem, right? And it's the 1-year duct tape solutions that this team employed at defensive tackle. Now, some of this might have had a lot to do with Joe Woods, right? If the defensive coordinator does not have a lot of emphasis on a position, then that position will not get the care it needs, the nurture it needs in order to develop the way it should. But that being said, it was Andrew Berry's job to find guys who could be out here for 1 year and be okay. And instead, we got Andrew Billings. Instead, we got, well, Malik Jefferson was fine the 1 year he was here, and so was the other Malik that got arrested. But then there was also Taven Bryant's, you know what I mean? Guys who just couldn't play. And I think Andrew Billings, if you look at all of the failures, Jordan Elliott, Tommy Togiai, those guys were late round picks. Andrew Billings was supposed to be a defensive tackle for this team for a little while. He was supposed to be a long-term solution for this team. He ended up playing like 8 games for this team in total in a 2-year contract. I think that was emblematic of all of the failures that was going on in the defensive line. Again, a lot of this had to do with the fact that Andrew Berry was picking players for a defense that did not emphasize the position. But that doesn't mean you get away with the lack of talent that we accumulated when we should have been able to get at least league average talent. We couldn't even get that. And Andrew Billings, who was a decent player elsewhere, signs here, played 6 games and was terrible in them 6 games. Unplayable on a defensive line rotation that Jordan Elliott was on. Like, that tells you everything that you need to know about that. The other big failure of Andrew Berry's era is John Johnson, right? John Johnson was brought in to be the piece de la resistance, or however you say that, of this defense. He was meant to be the fixer, the safety, the true safety that was going to fix everything. We are still looking for that with Juan Thornhill. Now, again, it's going to be a through line. A lot of these failures have to do with how these players were used. And on the defensive side, a lot of the blame goes to the defensive coordinator. Still doesn't mean that Andrew Berry doesn't get credit for signing these dudes, because if it would have worked out because of the defensive coordinator, Andrew Berry would have got credit for that. So it can't work one way. That being said, John Johnson played out of position. And here's where I blame Andrew Berry. If the goal wasn't to make John Johnson do what John Johnson did in LA, why did you sign him? If the goal was to move him and project him at different possessions, why was the projection so off? That's the question that needs to be asked when it comes to the failure of John Johnson in Cleveland and why that didn't work, and the many reasons in which that didn't work. Some of this is on Joe Woods. Yeah, did he use him in the wrong way? Absolutely. But they knew how they were going to use him when they signed him. Joe Woods and Andrew Berry were in agreement with how he was going to be used. And how he was used was just incompetent when you compare it to how he should have been used. And why would you sign a player to be used the wrong way? So if it was a projection, the projection was wrong, and you deserve blame for that. The last failure I have on this list is Austin Hooper. I mean, we spent 2 years complaining about him. In Austin Hooper's era, the only person who benefited from Austin Hooper being on the team was David Njoku. Because you have to remember, before Austin Hooper showed up, everybody was out on David Njoku. He wanted a trade request. Like, everybody was out on David Njoku. It seemed like we were at the point of no return for him at this city. And then Austin Hooper shows up and plays aggressively average over the span of 2 years. And that allows us to appreciate David Njoku so much more, to the point to where he has new light now. Seriously, that's how aggressively average Austin Hooper was. He was never a consistent catcher at the football, was never the blocker that he was promised to be, was never the route runner he should have been. He got over-targeted by Baker Mayfield for reasons that don't seem about football. It was just, again, nothing great happened with the Austin Hooper era in Cleveland. They did have the 1 year where they went 11-5, but that wasn't because Austin Hooper was playing at some insane level. That was just because the Browns were a good team that year and other moves were made. But that's what I would say is Andrew Berry's biggest failure in Cleveland. Now let's go to some of the successes so far. One of the big successes is, one, in general, his trades tend to work out, and we tend to be on the best side of these trades whenever he makes them. And I think the biggest example of this is the Amari Cooper trade. Browns traded, a fifth and a sixth for Amari Cooper, or a fifth for Amari Cooper, whatever it was ridiculously low. Now, again, I understand that the Browns were trading for a contract more than they were trading for a player, or at least the Cowboys were trading to get rid of a contract rather than a player. The Cowboys made the wrong move. The money was worth the player, right? Amari Cooper was worth the $20 million he made. Amari Cooper got traded here, and despite the fact that he had multiple quarterbacks throughout the season put up some of his career best numbers in touchdowns, almost a career high in receiving yards, he was as good as he's ever been, as reliable as he's ever been. Played the whole year. Then I don't think he missed a game. Now, this is something that Vaj told me when he got here. Vaj told me, hey, Amari's going to play hurt, but he's not going to be healthy the whole year, but he's going to play in every game. And that's what Amari did. He played well in every game. He played in every game. Great route runner, great example to the other wide receivers on the roster. And he's going to be a great piece to have with Deshaun Watson coming up in the future. And it's just another example of a good Andrew Berry trade. When it comes to trades, when it comes to contracts, I think Andrew Berry does a pretty good job with those things, and the penalty is not as high as what we think it's going to be with a trade or contract. The next thing that I would have to give Andrew Berry credit for is that 2020 O-line. Look, we've been talking about the Browns having the best O-line in football, and we forget that that wasn't the case until Andrew Berry was the general manager of this team. Say what you want about Andrew Berry versus against the last guy. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. It's been a very long day for me. But say what you want against him versus John Dorsey. Andrew Berry did a much better job at the offensive line than John Dorsey ever did. He took an offensive line that was one of the worst in the NFL and transformed it to the best offensive line in the NFL. He drafted Jed Wills, who, look, people don't love that pick, but it's still a solid left tackle in a draft where you could have done worse. You got Joe Bitonio re-signed. You brought in you didn't bring in J.C. Tretter, but you extended J.C. Tretter. You put Wyatt Teller, who was traded for with the last regime. You put him around the right coaching situation. And this is why I always would give Andrew Berry the credit for Wyatt Teller versus John Dorsey. John Dorsey traded for Wyatt Teller and had no plan. Just straight up had no plan for him, right? And Wyatt Teller was not good in 2019. Andrew Berry walks in there and has a plan for him, hires Bill Callahan. That is what ends up getting Wyatt Teller to this next level. So Andrew Berry does get credit for the improvement that Wyatt Teller did make. And then brings in Jack Conklin. Offensive line goes from one of the worst, one of the least protected offensive lines to one of the best, almost like in modern NFL history. So massive jump there. That's one of his biggest wins as a general manager. And it's one of the bigger wins that you can get as a general manager. The improvement that he made to this offensive line, even today, if you look at this offensive line today, and even though we have some concerns about it, miles better than the offensive line that the Cleveland Browns had in 2019 before Andrew Berry got here. So he deserves the credit for the just stark improvement. We went from a perennial bottom 10 offensive line to a perennial top 10 offensive line, even in a bad year. The best thing, or the last thing that I'm going to talk about that is something that Andrew Berry deserves a lot of credit for, I think one of the best things he did was moving all the whole everything quarterback related to last year. Now, it's remained to be seen whether the Deshaun Watson trade is going to be worth all of the draft picks and all of the money in the future. We have 4 or 5 years to determine whether that would be the case. This is not why I'm giving this honor. The reason I'm giving it this honor is we saw what Baker Mayfield was this year. It was pretty much the same guy that he was in 2021, right? Some good games, a lot of bad games, and a lot of it in between, right? That was what Baker Mayfield was this year. He had a couple good games in LA, had a lot of bad games, horrible games in Carolina, and a couple in between games in LA. That's kind of what he was. The Browns could have been in a situation where a lot of other teams would have also been in this spot where they would have paid Baker Mayfield and been stuck with that. And say what you want about the Browns' current situation at quarterback. If we would have been stuck with a Baker Mayfield contract, that would have been worse than whatever the Browns situation is. Levels of like degrees worse, much, much, much worse than what they're at now. Now they have a hope to have a franchise quarterback. You would have had a franchise quarterback bill without a chance of having a franchise quarterback. And that would have been an issue. So that's the first thing. Deciding to move off of Baker Mayfield, the Browns get tremendous credit for that. Not a lot of teams make that move when it needs to happen. You look at the Jaguars with Blake Bortles. You look at what the Giants just did with Daniel Jones. A lot of teams stay in the same spot because they never make an aggressive move for a quarterback, and that ends up capping their potential. And you spend a lot of money on that quarterback, and it caps your potential. Just pointing out a fact there. Browns decide to move off of that. Their potential is not capped. We don't know what their floor is right now, but we know that the potential can be Super Bowl with Deshaun Watson. Second thing that the Browns get credit for within that is Jacoby Brissett. Everybody made fun of the Jacoby Brissett sign. Everybody made all these articles talking about why we should get Jimmy Garoppolo or somebody else and how we can't possibly be serious about going into the season with Jacoby Brissett because it was that bad of an option. And Jacoby Brissett ended up being one of the top 10 quarterbacks according to PFF and QBR this year. He actually outperformed everybody's expectation. And outside of Geno Smith, you can argue was the second best quarterback transition that any team has made, right? From Russ to Geno, from Baker to Jacoby, the yields are similar, except for Geno was a lot more successful in the win column. So that is something that they get credit because nobody thought, well, not nobody, I thought, nobody national gave the Browns credit for bringing in Jacoby Brissett, even though I thought it was a smart move, and it turned out to be a really smart move as Jacoby Brissett gave the Browns as good as a chance of anybody at the quarterback position that you could have gotten a hold of making the playoffs. Now, ultimately, they didn't win enough games in those first 11 to make the playoffs because the defense stunk. But it wasn't the fault of the offense, and that's all you wanted in that period. And you deserve tremendous credit for that. As much credit as I'm giving him for the demise of the defense this year, you also get the credit for the offense being at a point to where we could even think about playoffs because, again, the Browns should have never been in a situation to be mad about not making the playoffs, but the play of Jacoby Brissett elevated this team's expectations to that level, and you deserve credit for that, for moving on from a quarterback and then moving on and getting 2 guys in 1 year that played better than that quarterback did. That is something that you get credit for. But that's it for today's video. Y'all tell me what y'all think in the comment section down below. Everybody have a great day. Have an even better night.